You're listening to Old Worlds for Sleep, a quiet place where forgotten cities still breathe, where old streets whisper what history tried to bury. Tonight we walk through London, not the London of empire and elegance, but the one built on smoke, hunger, and the quiet courage of those no one wrote about. Ashes of Whitechapel is their story, a journey through fever houses and fading hope, through voices that survived in ledgers when no one else listened. Let the noise of the modern world fade behind you. The lamps are dim, the streets are wet, and somewhere beyond the fog, the city remembers. Now, close your eyes. Let's go back to the London that sleeps beneath its own heartbeat. It was raining when I first arrived in Whitechapel, thin, bitter rain that seemed to slide beneath the skin rather than fall upon it. London doesn't welcome strangers. It studies you first, quietly, the way a wolf might study something small and tired. My boots sank into the mud as I followed the gas lamps through alleys that smelled of rot, smoke, and desperation. I'd come chasing work like everyone else who ever thought the city owed them a living. What I found instead was the Doss House. They called it Wilmot's, a long, sagging building squeezed between two warehouses that looked only slightly less ready to collapse. The door was open, light spilling onto the street in a sickly yellow blur. Inside, the air was thick with 100 breaths, with coughs, snoring, the rustle of rags. Men moved through the dimness like ghosts too stubborn to vanish. The keeper, a heavy man with a voice like gravel, took my last coins and pointed me toward a narrow staircase. Cabin 3, top floor. Don't touch nothing that isn't yours. The corridor was lined with partitions pretending to be rooms. Mine held a cot stuffed with straw, a single candle stub, and a ceiling that dripped steadily onto the floorboards. Still, it was shelter. I sat on the edge of the cot, listening to the chorus of London's forgotten. One man was praying. Another argued with himself. Somewhere nearby, someone wept softly in their sleep. The sound carried through the thin boards like confession. That was the night I met Fitzgerald, a gentleman once, by the sound of him. His voice had the polish of schooling, though his clothes spoke only of ruin. He offered me a bit of stale bread and asked, "First night?" When I nodded, he smiled faintly. "Then you'll learn. We all do. The first night hurts the most." There was Barney too, a wiry man with a laugh that cut through the gloom like a knife through gristle. "You knew? Don't mind the rats. They pay rent same as us." He grinned, showing teeth like broken stones. And William, barely more than a boy, hair too clean, eyes too hopeful. He told me he'd come from the countryside, thought the railways would hire anyone willing to work. "They will," Fitzgerald said, "for 6 pence a day and your spine in return." The candle burned lower. Rain drummed on the roof like distant footsteps. Somewhere outside, a woman's voice rose, singing a hymn to no one in particular. The melody wavered, thin and tired, but beautiful in its fragility. For a moment, even the coughing paused to listen. I lay back and stared at the leaking ceiling, wondering how long before this place swallowed me too. I had arrived with calloused hands and a bit of pride left. Both would be gone soon enough. When the candle finally died, darkness claimed everything but the sound, the endless breathing of men who'd stopped dreaming long ago. That's when I realized something strange. The Doss House wasn't silent because it was peaceful. It was silent because everyone was conserving their energy to survive the next day. Tell me, have you ever been somewhere that made you feel both safe and trapped at once? Somewhere that promised rest, but only if you surrendered your dignity at the door? If you closed your eyes right now, could you imagine what it's like to sleep among strangers who might steal the shirt off your back before dawn? In that darkness, I learned the city's first lesson. Survival is never free. Every roof has a cost. Every breath in Whitechapel feels borrowed. And as I drifted towards sleep, one thought circled endlessly in my head. If this is what the first night feels like, how many nights until I stop feeling it all? The first night never truly ends in a place like Wilmot's. It stretches, thin and uneasy, into the hours when time itself seems to hesitate. I woke to the sound of something moving in the dark. At first, I thought it was a man turning in his sleep. Then came the scrape, the soft rustle, the tiny sound of teeth against wood. Rats. London's other inhabitants. They lived in the walls, the floorboards, the straw of our bedding. And they were fearless, fat from crumbs, bold from hunger. I watched one climb over the partition, black eyes glinting like beads of coal. It paused on my chest, sniffed once, and darted away before I could move. The man beside me didn't stir. Either he didn't care or he'd stopped noticing long ago. The air smelled of sweat and mildew, of men stacked too close. Every breath came with a taste of iron and damp. Someone coughed, long and hollow, the kind of cough that doesn't end until the body does. In the dark, you can't tell who's dying and who's just asleep. "Keep your boots near you," Fitzgerald had warned before we lay down. "Rats like the leather." I hadn't believed him, until I saw one dragging away a shoelace that used to belong to William. The boy swore under his breath, but even that sounded tired. He'd learn soon enough. In the Doss house, you never truly own anything. Not your food. Not your rest. Not even your dreams. Outside, rain still fell, soft, steady, relentless. It slipped through cracks in the roof, dripping onto the floor in tiny, mocking rhythms. I counted the drops without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. As if each could measure how far I'd fallen. Somewhere down the hall, a man muttered in his sleep, "Don't take me back. Please." The words carried a weight that silence couldn't absorb. I wondered who he was begging. God. A debt collector? A memory? It was then I started to notice the rhythm of the Doss house itself, the way it breathed. You could hear the city moving through it like blood through veins too narrow. The groans of the building weren't random, they were its heartbeat. Wooden ribs shifting, old beams complaining, the occasional rattle of pipes whispering secrets of lives long forgotten. Barney called it London's lullaby. He said if you listened close, you could tell what kind of night it would be. Quiet groans meant peace. Sharp creaks meant trouble. That night, the whole house sounded like it was whispering warnings we didn't understand. I pulled the blanket tighter, though it smelled of smoke and mold. Fitzgerald stirred, muttering a line from some half-remembered poem. "The city feeds upon itself," he said softly, eyes still closed. "And we are what's left when it's done eating." Do you ever wonder what your city sounds like at its lowest hour? When everyone respectable is asleep, and only the forgotten keep it alive. Could you listen to that heartbeat and still call it home? I thought about leaving, just walking into the rain, following the lights until they faded. But where would I go? London was a maze that swallowed men whole. For those of us in the Doss house, even escape cost money. A sudden crash broke the silence. A man had fallen from his cot, shaking with fever. The keeper arrived, cursing, dragging him outside. No one spoke. No one helped. We all just listened to the door slam shut. In the Doss house, sickness wasn't an event, it was an inconvenience. I tried to sleep after that, but my mind kept wandering. I thought of my mother's kitchen, of warm bread and wood smoke. Strange how memory can feel like cruelty when it reminds you of something you can't return to. The more I tried to forget, the sharper it became. At some point, I must have drifted off. I dreamt of water rising, first around my boots, then my knees, then my chest. The faces of the men beside me blurred into shapes beneath the surface. When I woke, I was still breathing, but the dream lingered like fog. Morning came without sunlight, just a paler shade of gray. The keeper's bell rang and the house groaned awake. Men rose like soldiers at reveille, each performing the ritual of another day's survival. As I laced my boots, one question stayed with me, colder than the rain outside. If a man sleeps among rats long enough, does he start to dream like them too? Morning crept into Wilmot's like a thief, gray, cold, and uninvited. There was no sunrise here, only the slow brightening of filth. The first sound wasn't birdsong but coughing. A symphony of lungs grinding against soot and smoke. The air tasted like ash before breakfast even began. The keeper's bell clanged downstairs. "Bread and broth," he shouted, though neither word quite meant what they should. I followed the others into the kitchen, a narrow room lined with cracked tiles and the faint promise of warmth from a dying fire. A woman ladled something from a pot the color of dishwater. She didn't look at us, her eyes were somewhere else, maybe on a better life that had slipped through her fingers. We queued like soldiers waiting for rations. I held out my bowl, received a scoop of the thin broth, and a heel of bread hard enough to chip a tooth. Fitzgerald sat across from me at a rough wooden table. "The price of bread," he said, tapping his crust against the bowl. "You think it's 6 pence a loaf?" "No, it's pride. Always pride first." He smiled without humor and dipped the bread into his soup. Beside him, Barney tore his piece with yellowed teeth. "Could be worse," he said. "Could be the workhouse." "That's not living," Fitzgerald replied. "That's dying with supervision." William ate in silence, eyes fixed on his bowl as if willing it to fill itself. He was still too new to complain. Still believed this was temporary. I tried to chew, but the bread fought back. My stomach ached from emptiness and the effort of pretending I was eating. The taste was nothing, and somehow even that nothingness carried a flavor: salt, soot, and surrender. Have you ever eaten something not because you were hungry, but because it reminded you what hunger could do if you didn't? Have you ever swallowed shame with every bite and told yourself it was nourishment? The men ate quickly, guarding their bowls as if someone might steal the broth right from their hands. And some did. A fight broke out near the door. 2 men, 1 loaf, no witnesses. The keeper stepped in, swinging a stick. The smaller man fell, clutching his bread like treasure. No one moved to help him. "Don't stare," Fitzgerald murmured. "You'll get used to it." The words chilled me. You'll get used to it. That was the promise and the curse of the Doss house. It didn't just shelter you, it reshaped you quietly into something that could survive here. After breakfast, men scattered toward work, or the search for it. London streets were already awake, steaming with the breath of a million lives stacked on top of one another. I walked with William and Barney, following the line of laborers heading toward the railway cutting. On the way we passed a bakery. Through the window, golden loaves sat glowing behind the glass. Steam rose from fresh crusts, and the smell, God, the smell, was holy. We stopped without meaning to, just staring. Inside, a woman laughed as she handed a boy a warm roll. He bit into it, butter melting down his chin. For a moment, all sound faded, but that small, impossible sound, the crack of bread splitting open. Barney looked away first. "Move along," he muttered. "We'll be late." That smell followed us all the way to the worksite. I swear it lingered on my coat longer than the rain. At the railway cutting, men swarmed like ants, picking at the earth. Picks and shovels clanged in rhythm, each swing a note in London's industrial song. A foreman shouted orders, his voice slicing through fog. 6 pence a day if you last till dusk. The work was brutal. Mud sucked at our boots and the air filled with the grit of crushed stone. After an hour, I could no longer feel my fingers. William stumbled, fell into the muck, laughed weakly, then kept digging. Around noon, I saw a man collapse. The others stepped over him. The foreman barked, "Drag him aside. He'll wake when he's hungry." They did. You didn't? That was the day I understood the economy of suffering. Labor bought bread. Bread bought strength. Strength bought another day to labor. A perfect circle with no exit. As the sun dipped behind smoke-thick clouds, I thought of Fitzgerald's words. The price of bread is pride. He was right. Every mouthful cost more than we could afford. When we returned to Wilmot's that evening, my back ached, my hands bled, and my 6 pence felt like a joke. Still, I clutched it as if it were salvation. I lay in bed listening to the house settle, wood creaking, rats scratching, men muttering in dreams. My stomach was full, but my soul felt hollow. And as I drifted toward sleep, one question pressed against my ribs like hunger itself. When survival demands everything you have, what part of yourself do you stop feeding first? The railway cutting was a wound carved into the earth, and we were the flies that crawled along its edges. Dawn had barely broken when we arrived, boots sinking into mud black as ink. Steam from the city hung low, mixing with the breath of hundreds of men shoveling, hammering, straining. It was less a workplace than a battlefield that never stopped claiming its dead. The foreman shouted above the noise, his voice carrying the weight of indifference. 6 pence a day. Break your back proper, and maybe I'll forget to dock your pay for breathing too long. The men laughed because the only other choice was to cry. I took my place beside William and Barney. The ground trembled with each pickaxe strike. You could feel London itself vibrating beneath your feet, the heartbeat of a city fed by sweat and misery. We worked shoulder to shoulder, turning clay to rubble, rubble to dust. The air was thick with the taste of metal and damp earth. William tried to speak over the clatter. "Reckon this'll ever end?" "What, the work or the hunger?" Barney shouted back. "Both," William said. Barney only grinned, the expression sad and knowing. One ends when the other does. Hours passed, measured only by pain. Hands blistered. Faces darkened with grime until everyone looked the same shade of exhaustion. At midday, the foreman called for a break. Men sat in clusters, eating crusts of bread, smoking the last inches of borrowed cigarettes. I tried to rest, but the sound of shovels never truly stopped. There were always some too desperate to pause. They feared if they rested, they'd never start again. That was when the accident happened. A shout. A rumble. Then the ground itself gave way. A section of the embankment collapsed, swallowing 2 men whole. For a moment, everything froze, tools suspended mid-air, mouths open but silent. Then came the rush, men digging frantically, hands clawing at the mud. We pulled one out, his leg twisted wrong, eyes wide with disbelief. The other never surfaced. The foreman arrived, looked at the body half buried in the earth, and spat. No time to dig him out. Fill it in. Can't leave the cut unstable. No one argued. No one dared. We just filled it in. Shovels moving mechanically, covering what had been a man an hour before. Each scoop of dirt felt heavier than the last. By the end, it looked as if he'd never been there. William stared at the patch of fresh soil. "They'll tell his family?" he whispered. Barney shook his head. "He's got no family. Just debts." The work resumed as if nothing had happened. The foreman lit a pipe and shouted for the wagons to move. The noise returned, swallowing the memory of death the way the earth had swallowed the man. Have you ever seen the world continue as if your grief were just a momentary inconvenience? Have you ever realized how small a life can look when measured against profit? By dusk, my muscles screamed. I'd stopped feeling my hands hours earlier. The whistle blew, and men began their long trudge back to Whitechapel. No one spoke about the one we'd buried in silence. We just carried his absence with us like another layer of grime. Rain began to fall again, thin, cold, endless. It washed the blood from our knuckles but not from our thoughts. The streets glistened under the gas lamps, every puddle reflecting a face too tired to recognize itself. William walked beside me, shivering. "Do you think he knew?" "Knew what?" I asked. "That he was going to die here." I didn't answer. Some truths are too cruel to speak aloud. Back at Wilmot's, the men filed in, boots dripping, faces blank. The keeper took our 6 pence each like a priest collecting offerings at a church of despair. I handed over my coin, feeling it stick to my palm before it left me. The sound of it hitting the tin box echoed longer than it should have. Fitzgerald was waiting upstairs. "Rough day?" he asked, though he already knew. "One man gone," I said. "The ground took him." He nodded slowly. The city always collects its rent. Sometimes in coins, sometimes in lives. That night, as I lay in my narrow cot, the image replayed behind my eyes. The dirt falling, the silence afterward, the casual way we'd erased a man from existence. I could still taste the dust in my mouth, dry and bitter. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it brought dreams of digging. Only this time, it was me beneath the soil, my own hands reaching up through the mud while others shoveled on without looking. And in that darkness, I wondered, when the city decides you're no longer useful, does it bury you in the ground, or just forget you above it? Evening in the East End came not as darkness, but as surrender. The light didn't fade so much as give up, swallowed by smoke and soot until every lamp looked like a dying star. After a day at the cutting, we moved through London's veins like exhausted blood, drifting wherever hunger led us. The streets steamed with rain and refuse. Children picked through piles of rubbish, searching for something that might once have been food. A dog barked somewhere, thin and desperate as the men who ignored it. The smell was a blend of everything the city produced and forgot. Coal smoke, rotting vegetables, cheap gin, human fatigue. Fitzgerald walked ahead, collar up against the drizzle. William lagged behind, staring at the windows of the shops that lined Whitechapel Road. Behind the glass, meat pies, oranges, bread loaves stacked in neat pyramids, all shining under gaslight like offerings to a god who only blessed those who could pay. He pressed a hand to the glass as we passed a bakery. "Smells like heaven," he whispered. "Smells like memory," Fitzgerald said. "Heaven's not on this side of London." We stopped near a pie stall run by an old woman with eyes like sharp needles. She looked us over, measuring worth in pennies and pity. "Halfpenny meat pies," she said flatly. "Mostly meat, mostly." I reached for my pocket. 6 pence from the day's work, already half gone once Wilmot's keeper took his due. I handed her a coin anyway. She gave me 3 pies wrapped in paper that leaked grease. I gave 1 each to William and Fitzgerald. The first bite burned my tongue but filled my chest with something close to relief. The meat was unidentifiable, the crust too thick, but it was warm. That was enough. Around us, the street pulsed with life. Costermongers shouted their prices. Women in shawls haggled over bruised apples. A drunk sang half a hymn before collapsing in the gutter. A man with no shoes knelt beside him, not to help, but to search his pockets. Survival had no etiquette here. Fitzgerald finished his pie and leaned against the lamppost, staring down the street where the glow grew warmer, steadier. "West End," he murmured. "Another world." We followed his gaze. Beyond the boundary of Whitechapel, the streets widened, the air cleared, and the smell changed, from smoke to perfume. We walked farther than we should have, drawn by curiosity more than courage. The rain lightened to mist as we crossed from one existence to another. Suddenly, London transformed. Gas lamps stood taller here, their flames steady and bright. Horses drew carriages with polished brass fittings. Women in silk stepped from them, their laughter like the clinking of silver coins. Men in top hats strode confidently toward restaurants whose windows glowed with chandeliers. I stopped before one such window. Inside, a couple dined beneath a painting of pastoral fields. Their plates gleamed with roast meat, potatoes, and wine. The woman lifted a fork with fingers adorned in jewels. She smiled at something her companion said, a small, effortless smile, the kind that belonged to people who never wondered about tomorrow. Outside, my reflection overlapped theirs in the glass, a ghost superimposed on comfort. William stood beside me, silent. Fitzgerald exhaled smoke from a cigarette he must have scavenged. "They dine," he said softly, "and we dig. Do you hate them?" I asked. He shook his head. "No. I envy their ignorance. They don't know what keeps their world lit. The coal dust in our lungs, the blood in the clay. If they did, they couldn't eat so calmly." We lingered until a constable waved us along. "Move it," he said, not cruelly, just efficiently. We were cluttered to be cleared before the respectable hours began. On the walk back, the city changed again. The pavement narrowed, the lamps dimmed, and the smell of decay reclaimed the air. By the time we reached Whitechapel, London looked like itself once more, tired, wet, endlessly hungry. William spoke first. "Do you think they ever come here?" "Only in newspapers," I said. Fitzgerald smiled faintly. "Or nightmares." Back at Wilmot's, I lay on my cot, still tasting the pie and the bitterness beneath it. The city hummed outside, eternal and indifferent. Hunger had many forms, some for bread, some for warmth, some for justice. I thought of the couple in the restaurant and the child picking through trash. Both Londoners, both alive. And yet between them lay a gulf no bridge of charity could cross. Rain began again, tapping the roof like a patient hand. I closed my eyes to the rhythm of it, listening to the city breathe through the cracks. And as sleep crept closer, one thought returned. In London, the rich dream of travel, the poor dream of eating, and the city itself, perhaps it dreams of silence. Night fell heavy on Whitechapel. Not the gentle kind of darkness that invites rest, but a thick, watchful gloom that clung to the bricks and whispered through the rain. The lamps burned low, their light trapped inside globes of mist, making every shadow feel alive. I had left Wilmot's to clear my head. The air inside was too thick with coughs, smoke, and dreams that never went anywhere. The rain had thinned to a drizzle, soft enough to ignore if you were too tired to care. I walked without purpose, the soles of my boots slapping through puddles that reflected fragments of yellow light. London after midnight belonged to a different kind of life. Cats prowling for scraps, drunks singing to no one, footsteps that followed you but never caught up. Somewhere a church bell struck 12. The sound floated through the fog like a warning too late to matter. That was when I saw her. She stood in a narrow alley between two warehouses, half hidden by the steam rising from a grate. A woman wrapped in a shawl dark with rain, hair plastered to her cheeks. Her face was pale, almost luminous in the half-light. She wasn't moving, just standing, staring at something I couldn't see. "Evening," I said softly, not wanting to startle her. Her eyes shifted to me. They were tired eyes, the kind that had seen too much and been seen too little. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her voice carried the brittle calm of someone long past fear. "Neither should you," I replied. She smiled faintly. "I live here. What's your excuse?" I had none. Only restlessness. Only the strange pull of streets that made you feel more awake the darker they grew. She turned slightly, revealing a small bundle of paper-wrapped parcels in her arms. "For the bakery," she explained. "They throw away the stale bread. I fetch what I can before the rats do." Her hands were raw from cold, fingers trembling as she adjusted the shawl. I noticed a bruise on her wrist, half hidden beneath the fabric. "You work there?" I asked. She shook her head. "Worked? What?" Now I just collect what's left. Her words hit harder than she meant. Collect what's left. That was all any of us did in the East End. Bread, wages, dignity, hope. We scavenged what London discarded. Do you have somewhere to go tonight? I asked. She laughed softly. I have too many places to go and none to stay. The sound of approaching footsteps broke our quiet. Two men came from the far end of the alley, shadows first, faces later. They weren't workers. Their coats were too fine, their smiles too cruel. Evening, Rose, one of them drawled. Out gathering crumbs again? Her face stiffened. I understood then that this wasn't the first time they'd found her. I stepped forward. Leave her be. The taller one glanced at me and grinned. And who's this then? Her guardian angel? No, I said. Just someone who doesn't like bullies. The shorter man moved closer, the lamplight catching the knife in his hand. It wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Rose did. She threw the bundle of bread at them. The paper burst open midair, scattering crusts across the cobblestones. In that instant of surprise, she grabbed my wrist and pulled me into a side passage. We ran through the rain-blurred maze of alleys until the shouts behind us faded into distance. We stopped beneath an archway, both gasping. My heart hammered like a steam engine. She leaned against the wall, laughing breathlessly. You shouldn't have done that. They don't forget faces. Neither do I said. Rain dripped from the eaves, tapping against the stones in slow rhythm. The city seemed to hold its breath. Why do you stay here? I asked finally. Because there's nowhere else, she whispered. And because someone has to feed the others. Others? She nodded toward the darkness. Children. Down by the river. They sleep in crates under tarps. The bakers leave what they can't sell and I take it to them. Sometimes it's enough. Her words silenced me. She turned to leave, wrapping her shawl tighter. You'll forget this by morning, she said softly. Everyone does. But I didn't. I watched her walk into the fog until she was just another shadow among thousands. Back in my cot at Wilmot's, I lay awake listening to the rain. I thought of Rose, the woman in the alley, who risked knives for bread and called it living. Her courage felt larger than the city that crushed it. And as the night stretched thin, one question lingered. In a world built to forget its poor, who remembers the ones who choose kindness over survival? Morning arrived in fragments, a gray light leaking through broken shutters, the sound of boots in the corridor, the smell of damp clothes refusing to dry. I hadn't really slept. Rose's face lingered behind my eyes, that strange mix of strength and surrender. The woman who fed ghosts beneath the city. Fitzgerald noticed my silence over breakfast, thin tea and a slab of bread that tasted of dust. Still chasing dreams? He asked. Maybe, I said. Or maybe they're chasing me. He studied me a moment, then nodded as if that was answer enough. After the meal, I left Wilmot's. The air outside was sharp and wet. A fog had rolled in from the river, turning every alley into a secret. I followed instinct more than direction, tracing the route from last night by smell and sound. The iron tang of the Thames, the creak of wagons, the hush of early morning prayers whispered behind tenement walls. The alley looked different by daylight. Less haunted, more broken. The puddles were gone, but the smell of rot clung to the bricks. The bakery door stood ajar, its shelves half empty, the scent of stale bread drifting out like a memory. Looking for something, love? A voice called. The baker's wife stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, face powdered with flour. There was a woman, I said. She came here last night. Dark hair. Called herself Rose. The woman's eyes flicked toward the door, then away. She's been by before. Takes what we can't sell. She's a kind one, though kindness doesn't fill bellies. What? You a friend? I think so, I said. If I can find her. She hesitated, then pointed toward the river. Try the arches near St. Catherine's docks. There's children there. She looks after him, God help her. The Thames smelled of smoke, salt, and secrets. Ships groaned at their moorings, their ropes taut against the tide. Beneath the wharves, the city changed again. The underbelly of empire, where the sunlight never reached and the water lapped against stones blackened by centuries of waste. I found them under one of the arches. Half a dozen children crouched around a barrel fire, eyes wide and hollow. Their clothes were rags, their faces streaked with soot and hunger. One boy, no more than 8, held a crust of bread like it was gold. Rose was there, kneeling beside them. She was dividing a loaf into equal pieces, careful that no crumb was wasted. When she saw me, her expression flickered between surprise and irritation. "You again. You said you fed them," I said. "I didn't believe you." "Most don't," she replied, handing a piece of bread to the smallest girl. "Belief doesn't fill stomachs either." I crouched beside her. "Why do you do this?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched the children eat, her eyes softening with something like peace. "Because I remember being one of them," she said finally. "Because no one else will." One of the boys tugged at her shawl. "Miss Rose, there's no more." She smiled, tore her own portion in half and gave it to him. "There is now." I felt something shift inside me, a quiet shame like standing in a church with muddy boots. I reached into my coat and pulled out a coin. "Take this," I said. "Buy more bread." She shook her head. "If I take it, they'll steal it before nightfall. You buy it. Bring it here." So I did. I returned to the bakery, spent 2 of my precious 6pence, and came back with a paper sack that smelled of salvation. The children's eyes followed it like cats watching a bird. Rose took the loaves, broke them evenly again, and whispered, "You'd be surprised how far a loaf can go when it's cut by mercy instead of greed." When the children finished, some curled up to sleep against the stone wall, others watched the river. The fog thickened until the world shrank to the glow of the barrel fire and the rhythm of the tide. "You could leave this place," I said. "Find shelter. Work." She laughed quietly. "And who would feed them then? The city doesn't miss what it never sees." "Then let me help," I said. The word surprised even me. Rose studied my face as if searching for deceit. "Help," she repeated. "That's a dangerous word here. It makes you visible. People notice when you start caring." "Then let them notice," I said. For a long moment, the only sound was the river breathing. Then she nodded once. "Tomorrow," she said, "before dawn. Bring bread, and if you can, bring hope. It's rarer." As I walked back through the fog, her words followed me, soft as the mist and heavy as the truth. At Wilmot's, Fitzgerald looked up from his cot. "Out walking again? You'll catch death." "Maybe," I said. "But I found something better than sleep." He frowned. "And what's that?" "Purpose," I whispered. And as I lay down, the image of those children by the river burned quietly in my mind, small fires against an endless night. "Tell me, have you ever seen someone live for others when they could barely live for themselves?" The next morning broke slow and brittle. Frost webbed the windows of Wilmot's, turning grime to lace. Men groaned awake around me, the smell of cold sweat and damp wool clinging to the air. I left before the keeper's bell. My boots found the road to the river by memory now. The fog hung low, muting sound, swallowing shapes until London felt like a dream half forgotten. When I reached the arches, the fire from the night before was gone. Only ash trampled into the mud. The children were not there either. For a moment panic caught in my chest. Had the constables come? Had hunger taken them? Then I saw her. Rose stood farther up the embankment, her shawl drawn tight, a loaf of bread cradled like an infant. "You came," she said, not smiling, just acknowledging. "I said I would." She nodded toward the narrow street beyond. "They're at the school. Come if you like. It's not much of one, but it's the only thing that teaches them their people." We walked together through lanes that twisted like veins. The sound of the river faded behind us, replaced by the distant hum of carts and the chatter of early trade. Finally, we stopped before a soot-blackened building wedged between 2 warehouses. The sign above the door was barely legible, Ragged School. Inside, the air was warmer than I expected. A small stove rattled in the corner, fighting bravely against the chill. About 20 children sat on benches made of scavenged planks, their faces lit by thin daylight that filtered through filthy windows. A man in a frayed waistcoat stood at the front, chalk in hand, his voice rough but patient. "Morning, Mr. Clay," Rose said. He turned, smiled, revealing teeth worn to nubs. "Ah, Rose, brought us bread again, have you?" She held up the loaf. "And a new friend. He wants to see what learning looks like when it's done on an empty stomach." The man's eyes softened. "Then he'll see the truest kind of education there is." I watched as he wrote letters on the board, large, crooked symbols, some children copying with stubby pencils, others tracing shapes in the air. The effort was immense, the concentration fierce. You could feel hunger tugging at their sleeves, yet they fought to hold their place in the alphabet. One little girl recited the Lord's Prayer in a voice no louder than breath. Another boy stumbled over his words, then grinned when the teacher clapped him on the shoulder. Rose handed out pieces of bread from the loaf, one for each child. Crumbs dusted their desks like snowfall. They ate slowly, reverently, as if bread and knowledge were the same sacrament. "Most of 'em can't pay a penny," Mr. Clay said to me quietly. "But I keep a box near the door. When someone can spare a farthing, they drop it in. Keeps us in chalk and firewood." "Does anyone help you?" I asked. He chuckled softly. "Help? The city thinks charity's a luxury for the comfortable. We're too poor to deserve it." Rose knelt beside a child whose nose ran unchecked. "He used to be mine," she said. "My boy. Died last winter. Fever." She looked up at me, eyes steady. "So now I feed other people's sons." Her grief sat in the room like a ghost that refused to leave, yet somehow made everything kinder. When the lesson ended, the children lined up to thank the teacher. Some curtsied, some just nodded shyly. One boy handed him a pebble polished smooth by the river. "For you, sir," he said. Mr. Clay accepted it as though it were gold. "You see," he told me, "in places like this, generosity grows in the cracks where everything else dies." Outside, the fog had thinned to drizzle. Rose walked me back toward the docks. "You think it makes a difference?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. For a few hours, they remember they're worth teaching. That's something. I wanted to believe her. We stopped at a corner where the smell of fresh coal mingled with sewage. A man slept in a doorway, shivering. Rose placed the last piece of bread beside him. "He'll wake thinking angels visit Whitechapel," she said with a half-smile. I looked at her and realized she didn't believe in miracles. She made them one crumb at a time. Back at Wilmot's, Fitzgerald was mending his coat by lamplight. "You've been out again?" he said. "Yes," I replied. "To a school." He snorted. "For who?" "The rats." "For the forgotten," I said. "And for those trying not to forget them." He glanced up then, needle paused in his hand. "Careful, lad. The more you see, the harder it gets to look away." I lay in bed later, his words echoing. Maybe that was the price of caring. Once your eyes adjusted to the dark, you could never unsee what lived there. Outside, the rain resumed its slow tapping, like fingers spelling something on the roof, a lesson even the city might one day learn. "Tell me, if you had nothing left but one crust of bread, would you keep it for yourself or teach a starving child how to spell hope instead?" By the time word reached Wilmot's that the inspector was coming, the place was already pretending to be respectable. The keeper scrubbed the floors with lye, burned vinegar to hide the smell of rot, and shouted at anyone who didn't look presentable enough to pass for human. "You there, wash your face," he barked at William. "And you, Fitzgerald, hide that bottle. If he smells gin, we'll all be in the gutter." The irony made me smile. We already were in the gutter. The inspector was just another man trying not to see it. He arrived mid-morning, tall, thin, dressed in a brown overcoat so clean it looked like it had never touched the world. Behind him came a clerk with a notebook, the sort who measured compassion in neat lines of ink. "Mr. Wilmot," the inspector said, shaking the keeper's hand with a pinched expression, "I trust we're keeping order?" "As best we can, sir," Wilmot replied, bowing slightly. "Hard-working men, all of 'em. Few troubles now and then, but we keep 'em straight." The inspector nodded absently, his eyes already scanning the room. He walked like a man afraid the floor might stain him. He spoke to no one directly, only at us, not to us. "How many residents?" 73, sir." "How many employed?" "About half." "Any incidents of contagion?" "No, sir." "Good." The council frowns upon contagion. The clerk scribbled each answer with the rhythm of a man tallying debts. He moved through the kitchen next, sniffing the air. "This smell?" "Cabbage soup, sir. Tuesday ration." "Cabbage?" he repeated, as though the word itself were unsanitary. His gaze landed on me. "You there. How long have you lodged here?" 6 weeks, I said. "And are you employed?" "At the docks." "Excellent. Hard work builds character." He smiled the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. Then his gaze slid to William, who was pretending to scrub the table. "And you, boy?" "Railway cutting, sir," William answered quickly. The inspector nodded again, satisfied. "You see," he told the clerk, Industry is the cure. Once we separate the idle from the industrious, reform becomes possible. Reform. Such a pretty word, like gold leaf on a gravestone. He stayed less than half an hour. When he left, Wilmot followed him out like a dog seeing off its master. The air seemed colder once their footsteps faded. Industry is the cure, Fitzgerald muttered, lighting a cigarette. Funny how the cure always tastes worse than the disease. Later that day, I found myself at the ragged school again. Mr. Clay was patching the roof, while Rose swept the floor with a broom missing half its bristles. "Guess who came calling?" I said. "Not the landlord, I hope," Mr. Clay replied. "Worse. The council inspector." He paused mid-swing. "Ah, the ghost of good intentions." Rose looked up from her sweeping. "Did he ask about the smell?" "They always do. Never ask about the children." "He asked how many employed," I said. She smiled sadly. "They want numbers, not names. Easier to file misery when it doesn't have a face." Outside, the children were reciting the alphabet, their small voices rising into the fog. A few bystanders gathered to watch. Merchants, passers-by, one woman holding an umbrella with lace trim. She listened for a moment, then whispered to her companion, "How quaint. Little beggars learning letters." Then they walked away. Mr. Clay came to stand beside me. "That's how reform starts," he said. "Not with mercy but with curiosity. They want to see how far a child can climb before the ladder breaks." I thought of the inspector's notebook, the way he'd written our lives into margins. "Do they ever come back?" I asked. He shook his head. "Why would they? They've collected their pity. That's all they came for." The children finished their recitation, proud smiles flashing through soot-streaked faces. Rose clapped her hands together. "Good work, loves. You've done better than the lot of Parliament." They laughed, not understanding, and went back to their seats. Later, as dusk fell, I walked home through narrow streets shining with rain. Gaslight pooled in puddles, turning every reflection into a warped version of heaven. I passed men queuing for bread, women clutching infants, constables ignoring both. And I thought of that inspector's pen, scratching down the truth while seeing nothing. Perhaps that was the true disease of the age, not poverty itself, but the comfort of those who could describe it without ever feeling it. When I returned to Wilmot's, Fitzgerald had fallen asleep sitting up, the cigarette burned to his fingers. I took it gently from his hand and set it aside. His face in the lamplight looked older, softer, almost peaceful. Somewhere outside, a church bell rang 8 times. Tell me, have you ever watched someone measure suffering with a ruler, neat and precise, while never noticing the people bleeding beneath it? Winter came early that year. Not the pretty kind that paints windows with frost and makes chimney smoke look poetic. No, this was the kind that killed quietly, starting with the old, then the weak, then anyone unlucky enough to be both. By mid-November, the fog had turned to something thicker, something alive. It crept through door cracks, settled on blankets, and clung to lungs like wet cloth. The city coughed itself awake each morning. At Wilmot's, the men rose slower now. The keeper lit fewer lamps to save gas. You could see your breath indoors. We slept in our coats, curled like animals in a burrow. One morning, a man failed to wake. The keeper dragged him out before breakfast, muttering about frozen uselessness. His cot was filled by nightfall. Nothing stayed empty long in Whitechapel. Work at the docks didn't stop for weather. If anything, it got harder. The ropes stiffened with ice, crates slipped from numb hands, and the wind off the Thames cut through wool like knives. The foreman shouted louder to make us forget we couldn't feel our fingers. At midday, Fitzgerald leaned on his shovel and said, "You ever notice how the cold makes silence heavier?" I nodded. The world sounded muffled, like London was trying not to disturb its own misery. That evening, I took the road to the river arches. Rose was there as always. The children huddled close to a single-barrel fire, their cheeks raw, their breath forming ghosts in the air. She greeted me with a weary smile. "We burn anything we find now," she said. "Crates, driftwood, old books. Doesn't matter what. The cold doesn't care about words." I handed her a loaf of bread and a small flask of tea, still warm. She accepted both with quiet gratitude. "The schools are closed," she added. "Mr. Clay's lungs can't take the damp." "Is he ill?" I asked. "He's always ill," she said simply. "The poor don't get better. They just last a little longer." We stood in silence, watching the children fight over space near the fire. One girl coughed so hard it bent her in half. Rose pulled her close, wrapped her shawl around them both. "The fever's come early this year," she whispered. "There's not enough soup in London to stop it." She didn't cry. Rose never did. But her voice cracked on the word fever like glass underfoot. I sat beside the fire, rubbing my hands. The smoke burned my eyes. I thought of the inspector and his notebook. Did he have a line for this? Children 6. Fire 1. Hope none. A boy handed me a piece of wood to feed the flame. "It burns better if you say something good," he told me. "What do you say?" I asked. He shrugged. "That I'll be warm again tomorrow." I fed the wood into the fire and whispered the same. When I left, the fog had grown so thick I could barely see my own feet. The streets were silent except for the sound of coughing behind closed doors. Every alley smelled of smoke, sickness, and the slow decay of courage. At Wilmot's, Fitzgerald sat hunched near a candle stub, rubbing his hands over the flame. "They say the Thames froze solid once," he murmured. "Held a fair on the ice. People drank, danced, roasted chestnuts. Imagine that, a festival on top of death. Would you have gone?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Only for the warmth." That night I couldn't sleep. The wind found every crack in the wall, humming like a restless ghost. I wrapped my coat tighter and thought about Rose, about the girl coughing, about the children huddled under bridges while gentlemen wrote speeches about reform. Have you ever listened to a city breathe in winter? It's not the wind you hear, it's the sound of people trying not to die. By morning, snow had come. Dirty snow, gray before it hit the ground. The men at Wilmot's shuffled to the kitchen for their watery porridge. No one spoke. Even the keeper was quiet. Then, just as I lifted my spoon, the door burst open. A woman stood there, cheeks flushed, hair wild with frost. "Rose." "Mr. Clay," she gasped. "He's worse. I need help." No one moved. The men looked at her like she was a ghost. The poor didn't ask for help. They survived without it, or they didn't survive at all. I stood. "Where is he?" "At the school," she said. "Please." Fitzgerald pushed back his chair. "I'll come," he said. And just like that, 3 of us were out in the snow again. Rose leading, her breath rising in clouds. The world around us was white and silent, like the city itself was holding its breath. When we reached the school, the door was ajar. Inside, Mr. Clay lay on the floor, his face pale as chalk, the stove long dead. Rose knelt beside him. "He said he'd teach till the end," she whispered. Fitzgerald bent to check his pulse. He didn't speak, but the silence was answer enough. I closed the door against the cold. The chalkboard behind us still read the last lesson he ever gave. Hope, noun. A thing believed possible. We stayed until the frost took the light from the windows. That night I didn't dream. I just lay awake, listening to London exhale its smoke and sorrow. Tell me, what keeps a soul warm when even fire has forgotten your name? There was no priest. No coffin, no hymn, no tolling of bells. Only snow, the color of forgetting, falling softly over the East End. We buried Mr. Clay in the yard behind the ragged school, a strip of frozen earth between the wall and the river, where weeds used to grow before the frost killed even those. Rose had wrapped him in a blanket, the same one he used to keep the children warm when coal ran out. He'd rather stay close to them, she said, closer than the church would ever let him. Fitzgerald and I dug in silence. The ground was iron. The shovel rang each time it struck, echoing off the brick walls like a hollow sermon. The children watched from the doorway, small figures bundled in rags, eyes wide and too still. When the hole was deep enough, we lowered him in. The blanket looked thin, almost transparent against the white ground. Rose knelt beside the grave, brushing snow from his face one last time. "He taught until his voice went," she whispered. "Said the letters kept him warm. I think he believed it." I didn't know what to say. Words felt clumsy here, like stones thrown into still water. Fitzgerald cleared his throat. "He deserved better," he said softly. "But then so did we all." Rose reached into her pocket and took out a piece of chalk, worn to a nub, edges sharp from use. She dropped it gently onto the blanket. "For when he wakes," she said. The children followed, one by one, adding small offerings. A pebble, a crust of bread, a single button. None of it worth anything, yet somehow everything they had. When the grave was filled, the snow covered it almost instantly. The city wastes nothing. Even grief becomes part of its landscape. We stood there until the cold forced us apart. Rose lingered longest, whispering something I couldn't hear. Then she turned to me. "There's no record of him anywhere," she said. "No birth, no family, no grave marker. You'll remember him?" "Yes," I said. "And I'll tell others." "Then that's more than most get." We walked back toward Whitechapel as the day darkened. Smoke from the chimneys mixed with the falling snow, turning the air into a slow-moving fog of gray and white. The sound of factory whistles drifted across the river, the city's only kind of morning. Halfway home, we stopped at a tea stall. Rose warmed her hands over the kettle. The vendor eyed her warily but said nothing. Pity sells better than suspicion on days like this. "He believed words could save them," she said after a while. "The children?" She nodded. "Said learning made them human. Said ignorance was the first chain the poor ever wore." She blew on her tea, the steam curling around her face. "Funny thing though. He died teaching words he could never afford to print." Fitzgerald sipped from his tin cup, eyes distant. "Maybe that's what holiness looks like when you strip away the gold." His tone was half reverence, half resentment. Rose smiled faintly. "Holiness? We have plenty of that here, just none of the recognition." We finished our tea in silence. Around us, the streets blurred into twilight. Carriages clattered on distant cobblestones. The snow had already covered Mr. Clay's grave by now, maybe hiding the last trace of him from a city that never knew he existed. That night at Wilmot's, I found it hard to sleep. The men snored around me, their breath rising like smoke. I thought about that little piece of chalk lying beneath the earth, a tool of hope buried with a man who refused to stop teaching. When I finally drifted into dreams, they came soft and strange. Mr. Clay stood before a blackboard that stretched into the dark. He wrote one word over and over until it filled the sky: remember. I woke before dawn, heart heavy but steady. Outside, the first light of morning touched the snow, turning it gold for a heartbeat before the smoke reclaimed it. Tell me, have you ever seen someone die with nothing, yet leave behind everything that matters? That night, the river smoked like a dying candle. Fog rolled off the Thames, swallowing even the sound of footsteps. The lamps burned small and orange, trembling in the cold. Rose had sent word through the arches, a gathering after sundown for the children and whoever else still remembered Mr. Clay. She called it a reading, but the word didn't fit. It was something quieter, older. A vigil for the forgotten. When I arrived, they were already there. A circle of shapes in the half-light, huddled around a fire built from broken crates and hope. The children sat closest to the flames, hands outstretched like flowers to the sun. Men from Wilmot's had come too, silent and respectful, hats in hand. Even Fitzgerald stood near the edge of the light, his breath fogging the air like incense. Rose stepped forward, her shawl pulled tight, a small notebook clasped in both hands. "These were his words," she said. "The ones he wrote when he still believed London could listen." She opened the book, its pages warped from damp. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied. Asterisk, "If poverty is a sin," he wrote, "it is not the sinner who commits it, but the world that permits it." A murmur ran through the crowd, half pain, half agreement. The fire snapped like applause. She turned the page. "A man may live without bread for days, but not without dignity. Feed his body, yes, but feed his soul, or he will starve while eating." The wind shifted, blowing sparks into the fog. One of the children coughed. Rose paused to pull her closer, tucking the girl under her arm before continuing. "When the day comes that London counts its poor as part of its wealth, then the kingdom of God may begin. Until then, the work is ours." Her voice broke on the last words. For a long moment, no one moved. The fire hissed, and the city beyond the arches breathed its cold breath against us. Fitzgerald stepped forward, eyes reflecting the flames. "He was right," he said. "We keep waiting for mercy from those who've never needed it. Maybe we're the only ones left who can show it." Rose looked up at him. "Then say something, Fitz. He'd want you to." He hesitated, then nodded. "I once thought poverty was punishment," he began, a reminder of how far I'd fallen. "But lately I think it's the test instead, to see if we can still be kind when the world gives us every reason not to." No one clapped. No one spoke. The silence itself felt sacred. One of the boys, the same who'd told me that would burn better with good thoughts, stood and said, "Mr. Clay said we're not beggars. We're builders. Just building something no one can see yet." His small voice echoed through the archway. Even the river seemed to pause to listen. Rose closed the notebook. "That's enough words for tonight," she said softly. "Let the fire do the talking now." We stood there watching the flames shrink to embers. Above us, smoke rose to meet the fog, carrying Mr. Clay's sermon to a sky too distant to care. When the fire finally died, no one wanted to leave. The cold crept back in, reclaiming the space the warmth had borrowed. Rose touched my arm. "We'll do this again," she whispered. "Every winter until they remember." As the group dispersed, I walked with Fitzgerald toward Wilmot's. The snow underfoot was thin and brittle, crunching like old paper. "You think anyone heard us tonight?" I asked. He smiled without looking up. "Doesn't matter. We heard ourselves. That's how it starts." Back inside, the dormitory felt different. Not warmer, not cleaner, just less empty. The men slept deeper, their breathing slower, like something unseen had passed among them and left a little peace behind. I lay awake for a long time, replaying the sound of Rose's voice, the words that refused to die even when their speaker did. When sleep came, it brought a dream. Mr. Clay again, standing before a blackboard that glowed faintly in the dark. This time he wasn't writing. He was erasing. And when he finished, only one word remained, shining through the chalk dust: mercy. I woke to the sound of rain melting the snow, the city thawing just enough to move again. "Tell me, have you ever heard a sermon without a church, spoken not to save souls, but to keep them from freezing?" The morning after the winter sermon, London felt quieter. Snow had melted into slush, and fog drifted low like the ghost of the night before. The river steamed faintly under a pale sun, as though even the Thames was trying to remember warmth. I left Wilmot's early, drawn again toward the river arches. Rose was gone by the time I arrived. Only footprints in the thawing mud marked where she'd stood. The children had scattered, leaving behind the faint smell of smoke and wet bread. I wandered through the market streets instead. Barrows lined the road, wheels half buried in slush, vendors calling prices through scarves stiff with frost. "Threepence a loaf, halfpenny candles, coal by the sack." Among them, a small voice threaded through the noise. "Matches, sir? 2 for a farthing." I turned. A boy stood at the corner near a lamppost, his face barely visible under a cap too large for his head. He couldn't have been older than 8. In his hands, a small wooden box filled with bundles of matches wrapped in string. His fingers were red and cracked from cold. "Cold morning," I said. He nodded. "Colder if you don't sell." His teeth chattered as he spoke, but his tone carried a stubborn kind of pride. I bought 2 bundles. He counted the coins carefully, as though afraid they might vanish if he blinked. "You work for someone?" I asked. He shook his head. "Work for myself. Pa's gone. Ma sick. If I sell a dozen, we eat." He looked past me toward the bakery down the street. "She likes the smell," he added softly. I followed his gaze. Through the frosted window, loaves gleamed gold in the light. The boys stared as if they were stars. "What's your name?" I asked. "Eli." "Do you go to the ragged school?" "Used to," he said. "Before Ma got worse. Gotta mind her now." He rubbed his hands together, blew on his fingers. His breath came out in clouds. A gust of wind rattled through the alley. He hunched his shoulders, holding the matchbox close. "Sometimes I light one," he said quietly. "Just one. Not to sell. Just to see what warm looks like." Something in me broke a little at that. I took off my gloves and handed them to him. "Here," I said. "They'll fit well enough." He hesitated. "Then you'll freeze." "I'll manage." He slid them on, flexing his fingers. The gloves were too big, but he smiled anyway, a quick, shy thing that made him look even younger. "Thank you, sir." "Stay near the bakery," I said. "They'll let you warm yourself by the oven if you look small enough." He laughed once, a sound so thin it could snap in half. I always look small enough. I left him there, half hidden by the lamppost, the box of matches pressed to his chest like a secret. By evening, the fog thickened again. Back at Wilmot's, Fitzgerald sat at the table, staring into his tea. "Another one died last night," he said. "Old Carter. Froze in his bunk." No one spoke. The silence stretched, heavy as lead. Later I went out again. Something, guilt perhaps, pulled me back toward the market. The lamps burned low, the stalls shuttered, the world reduced to fog and footsteps. The lamppost was still there. The boy wasn't. Only the faint black streak on the wall where something had burned, small, circular, like the trace of a candle. Nearby lay an empty matchbox, damp and broken open. For a long time I just stood there listening to the drip of melting snow. A constable passed, giving me a brief nod. "Poor blighter," he said. "Shouldn't be out after dark. Found him this morning, curled up right there. Box still in his hands." He walked on without waiting for a reply. I picked up the matchbox. Inside were a few unburned sticks, thin, fragile, each one a promise never kept. When I reached the arches, Rose was there again, tending to the children. The fire burned low, throwing tired shadows on the wall. I handed her the box. She looked at it, then at me. "Another?" I nodded. She took it gently, as if it were made of glass. "I'll tell the children he lit one," she said. "Just one, and it stayed burning." Her eyes glistened in the firelight. She placed the box near the flames, where its pale wood caught and glowed briefly before turning to ash. For a few moments no one spoke. The river murmured beyond the arches, the city breathing its cold breath over us all. Tell me, if a single flame could last a night, how many lives would London owe it by morning? By late December, Whitechapel no longer smelled of life. It smelled of smoke, of things burned to keep warm, wood, cloth, memory. Every street carried the scent of survival turned to ash. The snow that fell now was gray before it touched the ground. Men coughed up soot. Women wrapped shawls around faces gone thin as paper. The city's breath came in clouds that never quite vanished. At Wilmot's, the air was thick enough to taste. The stove burned day and night, fed by anything that would catch. Splintered chair legs, old newspapers, sometimes bits of crates stolen from the docks. Even heat had become a kind of theft. Fitzgerald was coughing again, the deep kind that rattled in the bones. "It's the smoke," he said hoarsely, though we both knew it wasn't only that. Rose still tended her fires beneath the arches, her flock of children smaller now but somehow louder, as though defying the silence winter demanded. Each time I brought bread, she smiled without joy and said, "You can't imagine how heavy kindness gets when you carry it too long." One night, I found her standing by the river, staring into the black water. "The fever's taken two more," she said. "I buried them in the mud. No names, just little bundles, like parcels nobody claimed." She didn't cry. She never did. The Thames groaned under a crust of ice, the tide moving sluggish beneath it. "Sometimes," she whispered, "I think London is built on bones and smoke. Every brick's got someone's breath trapped inside it." I didn't answer. There are truths you don't reply to, only carry. The next day the docks were quiet. Too cold for ships, too sick for men. We gathered in the warehouse, rubbing our hands and pretending to plan work that wouldn't come. Someone read aloud from a newspaper, "Government debates housing reform for the poor." A ripple of laughter passed through the men, sharp, brittle, bitter. "Reform?" said Fitzgerald. "That's a fine word. You can't eat it, but it fills a speech nicely." Another man snorted. "They'll build new houses when we're all dead enough to stop complaining." We laughed too, because not laughing would have meant remembering why it wasn't funny. That evening, I walked home through Whitechapel Road. The shops were closing early, fog swallowed the lamplight, turning it into faint halos. A woman sold chestnuts from a brazier, the glow painting her face gold and red. I bought a handful, though I wasn't hungry. The heat stung my palms, proof I was still among the living. Farther down, I saw smoke rising from an alley that shouldn't have had fire. For a moment I thought it was Rose's group, but the smell was wrong. Chemical. Bitter. I ran closer. A tenement was burning. The flames crawled up its side like something alive, licking through windows, spilling sparks into the street. People shouted from the rooftops. Buckets passed hand to hand, hopelessly small against the roar. Someone screamed a name. Another threw a coat over their head and ran inside. I'll never forget the sound that came out. Not a cry, but the rush of air when fire finds new lungs. When the blaze finally died, there was little left, only the smell of wet cinders and the outline of walls black against the sky. A constable told us 3 families had lived there. 8 gone. Maybe more. He didn't sound sure. Among the crowd, I saw Rose, face gray with ash. She held something in her hands, a small tin box, half melted. Inside were bits of chalk and a child's drawing, smoke-stained but visible. A house, a sun, and stick figures holding hands. Mr. Clay used to make them draw their homes, she said quietly. Said it helped them imagine one. The paper crumbled as she spoke. She didn't try to stop it. Later, as we walked away, Fitzgerald muttered, "Ashes to ashes. Isn't that what they say?" I nodded, though the words felt too neat for what we'd seen. Back at Wilmot's, I lay awake long after the lamps went out. Through the thin walls came the sound of coughing, of men twisting in their sleep, of the city outside groaning under its own weight. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, another chimney collapsed, sending up a brief orange flare before darkness swallowed it again. I closed my eyes and saw the burned tenement, the paper house, the tiny sun drawn by hands now gone. Maybe Rose was right. Maybe London was built on bones and smoke. Maybe that's what keeps it standing. Tell me, if a city rises from ashes, how many lives must it burn before it calls the result progress? He came in a carriage. That alone was enough to make heads turn in Whitechapel. The wheels hissed through slush like something too clean for the street it crossed. The coachman didn't even bother to avoid the puddles, as though the water here wasn't worth the courtesy. Rose had gathered the children in what was left of the schoolhouse when the door opened and he stepped in. A tall man in a fine wool coat, gloves the color of cream, and a silver-tipped cane that never once touched the floor. His eyes moved through the room like he was cataloging exhibits at a museum. "Good day," he said, voice smooth, trained, deliberate. "I am Mr. Harrington. I represent the Society for Urban Renewal and Philanthropic Endeavor." The words were so polished they almost slipped on themselves. Rose straightened, her shawl still dusted with ash. "We don't get many visitors from the West End." He smiled thinly. "I'm not here to visit, madam. I'm here to observe." He gestured to the children. "We are conducting a report for Parliament. The condition of London's destitute. I've been told this school provides an illustrative example." Mr. Clay would have hated that word, illustrative. Rose's eyes narrowed. "These are children, not examples." He gave a soft chuckle. "Of course. But to help them, one must first understand them. Data before sympathy, as they say." He removed his gloves and brushed a finger along one of the desks, frowning at the grime that clung to it. "How many pupils?" 20, she said. "Sometimes less. Sometimes none. And their parents? Dead. Working. Or wishing they were one or the other." Harrington wrote something in a small leather notebook. "Tragic," he murmured, though his tone sounded more like fascination than sorrow. He turned to me. "And you, sir? You assist here?" "Sometimes," I said. He studied me a moment. "You have an intelligent face. Shame to see it wasted. Men of your sort ought to pull themselves up." "By the bootstraps?" I said quietly. He smiled again. "Quite." He walked slowly through the room, tapping his cane against the floorboards. "You know, Miss Rose, there are plans in motion, great reforms. Charitable housing, work programs, better sanitation. London cannot ignore her own conscience forever." Rose folded her arms. "Reform sounds fine from a parlor chair. But here, reform's just a rumor with good manners." He tilted his head, studying her. "You have spirit. Admirable, though misplaced. Perhaps the society could use you. A woman like you brings authenticity." The word hung in the air like smoke. "Authenticity?" she repeated. "You mean poverty that looks good in print?" He said nothing, only smiled, the way men do when they've been told the truth and refuse to acknowledge it. Outside, the carriage horse stamped impatiently, sending up small bursts of steam. Harrington closed his notebook and replaced his gloves. "We'll be in touch. Perhaps next winter, when our funding committee reconvenes." Rose didn't answer. As he turned to leave, one of the children tugged his coat. A little girl with soot on her cheek held out a drawing. A stick figure house, a sun for crooked smiles. "For you, sir," she said. He looked at it as though she'd handed him something contagious. "How quaint," he murmured, then tucked it into his pocket without bending down. When the carriage finally rolled away, the silence it left behind was louder than his voice had been. Rose exhaled slowly. "He'll put us in a report," she said. "We'll be a paragraph between sewage and sanitation." Fitzgerald, who'd been leaning against the doorway the whole time, muttered, "And he'll call it progress." We spent the rest of the afternoon mending desks, sweeping soot, pretending the visit hadn't unsettled something inside us. But that night, as I lay awake in Wilmot's, I kept thinking about his notebook, about how neatly he'd written our lives down, how tidy we must look on the page. Outside, the snow began again, falling on roofs and rags alike, without preference or mercy. Somewhere beyond the fog, a church bell chimed for evening mass. I wondered if Mr. Harrington heard it, and whether he mistook its echo for applause. Tell me, if pity builds a house, who lives inside it, the saved or the one still on display? They sent for Rose 3 days later. A boy from the society arrived at the arches with a letter sealed in red wax. The kind of color that means importance when you have nothing to compare it to. Dear Miss Rose, the Society for Urban Renewal and Philanthropic Endeavor cordially invites you to a charitable luncheon at the Langford Hall, Piccadilly. Your attendance, as a representative of London's working poor, would be most instructive to our members. She read it twice before saying a word. Representative, she murmured, as if misery were a profession. Still she went. Fitzgerald and I insisted on accompanying her partway, through streets that grew cleaner and quieter the farther west we walked. The air itself seemed different beyond Aldgate. Shops with glass windows, children with shoes, women whose perfume cost more than our monthly wages. By the time we reached Piccadilly, Rose looked out of place in a way that made people stare. Not cruelly, just curiously, as though trying to remember where they'd seen poverty before. The Langford Hall gleamed with brass lamps and polished marble. Inside, a chandelier spilled light across silver cutlery and floral arrangements that could have fed a family for a week. Servants moved silently between tables while laughter drifted like smoke. Mr. Harrington greeted her near the entrance. "Ah, Miss Rose? How splendid you could join us." She nodded stiffly. "I thought you said next winter." He smiled. "Well, compassion needn't always wait for the season, need it?" He led her toward a table already occupied by 3 women and a man who looked like he'd never missed a meal. "Everyone," Harrington announced, "this is Miss Rose, who directs a charitable school in Whitechapel." The women smiled, polite, perfumed, practiced. "How marvelous," said one, adjusting a diamond brooch. "Such noble work, helping those poor little creatures." Rose didn't reply. The man beside her leaned forward. "Tell me, Miss Rose, are they grateful?" She blinked. "Grateful? Yes. For your efforts. For civilization's mercy. Do they appreciate what's being done for them?" She met his gaze. "They appreciate food. And heat. The rest is harder to measure." A brief silence fell before laughter smoothed it over. The meal arrived: roast duck, white rolls, thick soup with cream floating on top. Rose stared at her plate. "You said luncheon," she whispered. "Not banquet." One of the ladies giggled. "Oh, my dear, you mustn't be shy. Please eat." But she didn't. She only touched the bread, running her fingers across its crust as though it were something holy. Mr. Harrington rose to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "today we dine not merely to indulge but to understand. We who possess fortune must learn from those who have none, that we may extend our hand wisely, not wastefully." Polite applause followed. Then to Rose, "Perhaps, Miss Rose, you could share your experiences. Tell us what poverty feels like." She looked at him, then at the expectant faces around her. Her lips parted, then closed again. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "Poverty doesn't feel," she said. "It endures. It smells of smoke and damp straw. It sounds like coughing that never stops. It tastes like bread when you've gone too long without it, sweet, almost cruel. And it looks," she paused, "a little like this room, only colder." The silence afterward was long and heavy. One woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Another whispered, "How moving." Harrington clapped softly. "Beautifully said. Truly we have much to learn." The conversation shifted after that, to investment opportunities, to weather, to the opera season. Rose sat very still, her uneaten bread beside her. When it was over, Harrington escorted her out. "You were magnificent," he said. "You gave them something to think about." "I wasn't trying to perform," she replied. He smiled faintly. "Everything's a performance, Miss Rose. Even sincerity. Especially sincerity." Outside the air was sharp and honest. Horse hooves echoed on the cobbles as gaslights flickered in the dusk. Rose stopped, looking back at the glowing windows. "Do they really believe it?" she asked. "That speeches and silver spoons can fix a world like ours?" "Perhaps," I said. "It's easier to feel generous than to be just." She looked down at the bread she'd slipped into her pocket. "They'll never understand hunger," she murmured. but maybe they'll remember the taste of guilt. As we walked east again, the fog returned, thicker, hungrier. Behind us, laughter rose faintly from Langford Hall, warm and bright as a fire no one would share. Tell me, when charity feeds pride instead of people, is it still kindness or just another appetite? The cold that week felt endless. Not the clean chill of frost on window panes, but a wet, heavy cold, the kind that sank into the marrow and stayed there. Even the rats had gone silent at Wilmot's. Fitzgerald had been coughing for days, though he pretended it was nothing. He still went to the docks, still worked through the rain, still came home at night smelling of coal and salt. But his voice had gone thin, like a violin string stretched too far. That evening, I found him in the corner of the common room, bent over a ledger, the kind the Doss house used for rent and wages. The lamp flickered beside him, throwing shadows across the page. "What's that?" I asked. He looked up, startled. "Record book," he said. "Barney used to keep it. Before he didn't finish." I sat down across from him. The ledger was filled with names, hundreds of them written in different hands. Some neatly, others scrawled, a few just initials. Next to each name, a date. And beside some dates, one word, deceased. I ran my finger down the page. "All from Wilmot's?" He nodded. "Every man who's come through since '79. Thought someone ought to keep count." I turned the pages slowly. The ink changed color, brown fading to gray, then black again. But the pattern stayed the same. Name, date, silence. "How many?" I asked. "Too many to matter," Fitzgerald said softly. "But I count anyway." His hands trembled slightly as he dipped the pen and added a new entry. The name was one I recognized. Barney Clark, February 2nd, 1889. "He passed last night," Fitzgerald said. "In his sleep. At least he got that mercy." I stared at the fresh ink bleeding into the paper. "You were with him?" He nodded. "He asked me to write something for him. Said he never learned his letters proper." "What did he want written?" Fitzgerald looked away. "He wanted to thank the nurse. And to tell his daughter he remembers her singing." The words hung between us like a ghost. I turned another page and saw something odd. A line drawn across the bottom, dividing the dead from the living. Below it, space left blank. "You keep writing," I said quietly, "because it makes them real." He smiled faintly. "Someone should remember them. The papers never will." The door creaked open. A gust of wind carried in snow and the smell of wet smoke. Rose stepped in, shaking off her shawl. She'd been out late again, bringing food to the children. "Barney's gone," I said. She froze. "He was meant to see the doctor tomorrow." "He didn't need one anymore," Fitzgerald murmured. She came closer, looking at the ledger. "You're writing them down?" "Trying to," he said. She touched the page gently, as though afraid to smudge the ink. "It's a book of ghosts," she whispered. Fitzgerald nodded. "A book of proof." He turned another page, and I saw his own name faintly penciled in the margin. Not in ink, not final, but waiting. "You shouldn't do that," I said quietly. "Everyone here's already written in," he replied. "It's just a matter of when it gets inked." The fire cracked in the grate, sending up a brief orange glow. Rose closed the ledger softly. "Not yet," she said. "Not while we're still breathing." Fitzgerald looked up at her, and something in his face shifted. Not quite hope, but the memory of it. "I used to keep ledgers for gentlemen," he said. "Debts, credits, balances. Funny thing, this one's more honest. Every line ends the same." Outside, a church bell tolled for evening prayers. The sound rolled through the fog, muffled but clear enough to count, 8 slow chimes. Fitzgerald picked up his pen again and wrote one more line beneath Barney's name. "Kind man. Sang sometimes." Then he closed the book. Later that night I couldn't sleep. The air inside Wilmot's was thick with the smell of lamp oil and damp clothes. I kept thinking of that ledger, of how it would keep growing long after we were gone. How many names before someone stops counting? How many before London remembers them as people, not statistics? Before I drifted into sleep, I imagined the ledger years from now, the ink faded, the paper brittle. Somewhere, a stranger opening it, running a finger down the list of forgotten men, and pausing just for a moment on one name. Maybe that pause would be enough. Maybe remembrance itself is a kind of rebellion. Tell me, when the living keep count of the dead, is it for the dead's sake, or their own? It began with a cough. Not Fitzgerald's, though his never stopped, but someone else's, one of the new men from the docks. A rasping, wet sound that tore through the thin walls of Wilmot's like a warning. Within days, half the house was coughing. By week's end, the air itself seemed to tremble with it. A smell of sweat, vinegar, and something sharper. The scent of fever, of bodies burning themselves to stay alive. The deputy pretended not to notice. "Not my concern," he muttered, collecting his coins each morning. They die. New ones'll come." But the sickness didn't stop at the door. It crept through every room, every breath. The nurse came once, carrying her worn leather bag and the same weary mercy in her eyes. She set up her corner clinic again, but this time the line of patients never ended. "It's typhus," she whispered to me. "Or close enough. Dirty water, bad air, worse luck. Can it be stopped?" She looked around the room, at the bodies slumped against walls, at the dripping ceiling, at the rats nosing under cots. "Not here," she said simply. By the third night, Wilmot smelled like a hospital and a graveyard combined. Men muttered deliriously, calling names of wives long dead or children they hadn't seen in years. Fitzgerald sat by the stove, boiling rags and water gone gray with ash. "Does it help?" I asked. He shook his head. Maybe it just feels like it should." Rose arrived with broth and clean cloths, her face pale beneath the lamplight. "The nurse says they're not taking more at the infirmary," she said. "Too many already." We worked through the night, wiping brows, feeding what little soup we had. The fever made the men wild. Some wept, some sang, some spoke to ghosts. At one point, Fitzgerald gripped my arm with surprising strength. "Don't let them shut the place," he rasped. "If they close Wilmot's, the sick'll just die in the street." He tried to stand, stumbled, then sank back onto the cot. I caught him before he fell. His skin was burning. "Rest," I said. He smiled faintly. Never learned how. For 2 more nights, he drifted between waking and delirium, muttering letters he'd never sent. "Emily, tell them I'm coming home, soon." Each time, Rose would place a damp cloth on his forehead and whisper, "Hush now, you'll scare the children in heaven." On the 4th night, the city inspectors finally came. 2 men in black coats and masks of gauze, carrying canes tipped with disinfectant cloths. They spoke little, but their faces, or what could be seen of them, showed disgust, not pity. "This place must be cleared," one said. "Contaminated beyond saving." "Cleared?" Rose demanded. "Where will they go?" "Not our department," he replied, writing something in his notebook. "The dead are to be removed at dawn." The nurse confronted them. "If you move them now, you'll kill the rest." The inspector didn't look up. "They're already dead. They just haven't finished it yet." He signed his paper and left. That night was the worst. The lamps burned out one by one. We used candles until even those guttered. The air turned thick, heavy with fever heat. I could barely breathe. Sometime near morning, I realized the coughing had stopped. Not because the sick had healed, but because most had gone quiet. Fitzgerald was still. His hand hung loosely off the side of the cot, fingers curled as if holding a pen that wasn't there. I touched his shoulder. Pull. Rose sat beside him, eyes red but dry. "He waited until dawn," she whispered. "Said he wanted to see the light." Outside, the first pale glow of morning bled through the window, touching the ledger on the table. I opened it with shaking hands. The last page was blank, waiting. I dipped the pen in ink and wrote his name. Henry Fitzgerald, March 7, 1889. Then I hesitated, added beneath it, "Came home in the end." Rose read it and nodded. He did. When the men came to take the bodies, we followed them to the street. Carts lined up, black wagons creaking under their weight, wheels slicing through the slush. No prayers, no hymns, just the sound of wood on cobble and breath turned to fog. The nurse stood at the corner, her hands clasped. "It's spreading," she said quietly. "Not just here. Dockside. Spitalfields. Maybe farther." London itself seemed feverish, coughing smoke through its chimneys, burning coal to stay alive. That night, Wilmot's was quieter than I'd ever known it. Only the creak of the roof and the whisper of the wind through broken panes. I found myself staring at the empty cot where Fitzgerald had lain. For a long time, I thought I saw the faint impression of his body still there, as if the bed remembered him. Tell me, when the fever passes, does the city wake, or does it just forget who it lost? When the fever broke, it didn't leave relief, only quiet. a kind of quiet that rang in the ears, as though the city itself was holding its breath. The bells had tolled for days, first from St. Botolph's, then Christchurch, then from somewhere beyond the river. Each chime meant another cart, another burial, another name in the ledger. And then one morning they stopped. The first thing I noticed was the absence. No coughing in the halls. No shouts from the street. Even the rats seemed unsure if they were allowed to move again. Wilmot's had emptied. The deputy had gone, ran off, they said, the night before the inspectors sealed half the rooms. The nurse was gone too, recalled to the hospital. Only Rose and I remained, along with a handful of men too weak to leave and too stubborn to die. The ledger sat on the table like an open wound. I flipped through it slowly, pages now filled to the edge, names stacked like bricks in a wall no one would ever climb. Fitzgerald's was near the bottom. I ran my thumb over it until the ink smudged faintly. Outside, the air smelled faintly of lime and ash, the disinfectant powder the inspectors used to purify the streets. It left pale streaks on the cobbles, like ghostly footprints leading nowhere. "Listen," Rose said quietly beside me. At first I heard nothing. Then faintly the sound of hooves. The carriage was coming. I tensed, half expecting to see Mr. Harrington again with his silver cane and sympathetic notebook. But this carriage was smaller, black, and unadorned. The driver wore mourning gloves. The man who stepped out wasn't a philanthropist, but a priest. His cassock was patched at the elbow, his collar yellowed by time. He carried no Bible, only a small bell in his hand. "I was told there were still souls here," he said softly. Rose nodded. "Plenty," she answered. "Just not all of them breathing." He bowed his head. "May I enter?" We led him inside. The priest walked slowly through the halls, pausing at each door. He didn't speak the formal prayers, just whispered names when we told them to him. Barney, Carter, Fitzgerald. Each name left his lips like a candle going out. When he finished, he set the bell on the table. "For whoever's left," he said, "when the next one goes." Then he left as quietly as he'd come. For hours afterward, neither of us spoke. The afternoon light filtered through the dirty windows, turning everything gold and gray at once. Dust drifted in the air like snow that had forgotten how to fall. Finally, Rose said, "Do you ever think about leaving?" I looked up. "Whitechapel." She nodded. "Every day." "Then why don't you?" I thought of the docks, of the small room I could afford now, of the way the city always called back its own. "Because someone has to stay," I said. "To remember." She smiled sadly. "That's what the dead always say." Night fell early. The fog rolled in low, carrying with it the distant smell of the river, iron and decay. I lit one of Eli's matches, the last from his box, and watched the flame flicker against the cracked wall. For a moment it looked like warmth. Then it was gone. The silence returned, vast, absolute. It filled every corner, every hollow space where breath had once been. Rose spoke again, almost to herself. "Do you hear it?" "Hear what?" "The city. Listening." I strained my ears, and perhaps she was right. In the distance, somewhere deep within London's iron heart, something shifted. Not a sound exactly, but a feeling, like the city had exhaled after holding sorrow too long. We sat there until the candles burned out. The only light left came from the faint orange glow of a far-off factory chimney, proof that life somewhere still went on. When I finally stood, Rose had fallen asleep in her chair, the ledger resting open in her lap. Her head tilted toward the page as if she were keeping vigil for every name inside it. Outside, a breeze caught the priest's bell and made it ring once, faintly, a single chime swallowed by fog. It sounded less like mourning and more like memory. Tell me, when the bells fall silent, is it because the dead have been heard, or because the living have stopped listening? By the time the frost began to melt, Whitechapel had changed its scent. The sharp sting of coal smoke had softened into something faintly sweet, like damp wood beginning to rot. The fever had passed, or so the papers said, and the inspectors had declared the district safe for commerce. But nothing about it felt safe. One morning, Rose stood at the window, watching light crawl down the opposite wall. "I need to see the river," she said suddenly. "Why?" "Because it moves," she replied. "Everything here's still. I can't stand still anymore." We left before noon, walking west along the narrow streets. The sun hung low and pale, thin as a coin rubbed smooth. Men were already back to shouting in the markets, hawking fish and coal as if the winter hadn't swallowed half their customers. Near Aldgate, a street preacher was yelling about judgment. His voice cracked in the cold air. "Repent, for the wages of sin is death." A few people tossed pennies into his bowl, others spat near his boots. Rose stopped beside him. "What's the wage for surviving?" she asked softly. The man frowned, not sure he'd heard right. But she was already walking again. By the time we reached the Thames, fog had begun to roll in from the east. The water gleamed dull silver under the bridges, carrying the smell of iron and tar. Barges drifted past like ghosts that never learned how to dock. We stood by the railing near Wapping. Across the river, factory chimneys exhaled steady plumes of smoke that merged with the morning mist. "Looks like the city's burning itself down one breath at a time," Rose said. I nodded. "Maybe it has to. Maybe that's how it stays alive." She leaned against the rail. "Do you ever wonder what it would look like clean? No soot, no fog, just light." "I can't imagine it," I said. "London without smoke is like a body without a heartbeat." She smiled faintly. "A sick heartbeat then." Downriver, a tugboat's whistle echoed, a long, mournful sound that carried farther than it should have. For a moment, everything else fell silent. No carts, no voices, just the pulse of the river. Rose turned to me. "Do you think the fever changed anything?" "Some of us are gone," I said. "Some of us remember. That's change enough, maybe?" She nodded, but her gaze stayed on the water. "Sometimes I think London doesn't care who dies inside it, as long as the chimneys keep smoking." We walked along the embankment, past piles of driftwood and the carcass of a barge half sunk in mud. Children were scavenging among the debris, laughing as they pulled scraps of rope and tin from the muck. Even here, life refused to stop. A ragged man sat near the steps, playing a harmonica. The tune was crooked, uncertain, but it carried warmth. Rose dropped her last coin into his hat. He looked up and nodded once, the kind of gratitude that didn't need words. "Music," she murmured. "It doesn't fix anything, but it remembers." We reached the bend where the bridge threw its shadow across the water. There, a small memorial had been built from stones, names scratched with chalk, offerings of wilted flowers, a child's shoe. One of the names was Fitzgerald. Rose knelt, traced the letters, then set down a small scrap of cloth. "He'd hate the fuss," she said. "He'd correct the spelling first," I added. That made her laugh quietly. The sound of it startled a gull into flight. We stood for a while longer, watching the tide carry away scraps of ash and straw. Somewhere a church bell rang, faint but familiar. I counted the echoes but stopped before the last. "I keep thinking," Rose said at last, "maybe the city isn't cruel. Maybe it's just tired." "Of what?" "Of pretending to be alive." The fog thickened then, wrapping around us like breath. From where we stood, London looked less like a place and more like a memory still deciding whether to fade. As we turned to leave, I glanced back one last time. The river reflected nothing. Not the sky, not the bridges, not even us. Only smoke. Tell me, when the river forgets its reflection, is it because the world above has changed, or because it's learned to keep its secrets? It began with a rumor. A carman at the docks said he'd passed through Dorset Street and found nothing where Wilmot's used to stand, just a pile of bricks and lime, already swept into neat rows by the council men. I didn't believe him. Buildings like Wilmot's didn't vanish. They collapsed, they rotted, they sank slowly into their own dirt, but they didn't disappear. Still I went. The closer I got, the stranger it felt. Streets I'd known by scent and sound looked unfamiliar in the pale spring light. Where once the air smelled of coal and cabbage, now it smelled of plaster and fresh mortar. Progress. Renewal. But when I reached the corner of Flower and Dean, there was nothing. No Wilmots. No crooked door. No cracked windows stuffed with rags. Just open ground, half dug and half filled again, like a wound trying to close. I stood there, waiting for the world to correct itself. A few laborers were working nearby, their shovels clinking rhythmically. One looked up. "You lost, mate?" "There used to be a house here," I said. "A lodging house. Wilmot's." He frowned. "You sure?" "Been empty ground since last month. Council cleared the whole block. Fever houses, they said." Fever houses. That's what they called the ones where too many died too fast. Safer to erase them than to disinfect. I walked across the lot. Under the dirt, fragments of brick glimmered faintly, wet from the morning rain. A bit of iron bed frame, a hinge, a piece of blue china. The ruins of small lives. Near the center, I saw something sticking out of the mud. A book, its cover swollen with damp. I pulled it free. The leather was cracked, the pages fused together, but I knew the feel of it. The ledger. It fell open on its own to the last written page. The ink had bled, the names blurred into rivers of black. Only one line remained clear. Henry Fitzgerald came home in the end. The words looked almost new, as if time had refused to touch them. Rose arrived not long after, breathless from the walk. "Is it true?" she asked. "They tore it down?" I showed her the book. She took it carefully, holding it like a newborn. "They said it was for sanitation," she whispered. "Said they'd build new flats. Clean, bright ones. For respectable families." "Not for us," I said. "Never for us." She crouched beside the dirt and brushed at the ground until her hands came away brown. "I used to sit right here," she said quietly, "by the stove. The sound of the men talking, the smell of soup burning." She stopped. "Feels wrong that it's gone." I looked around. The air was too open, too silent. Even the wind seemed cautious, as if afraid to stir the ghosts that hadn't finished leaving. Behind us, a foreman shouted to his crew, "Fill it in. We start paving Monday." Rose flinched. "They'll bury it under stone," she said. "Maybe that's mercy," I replied. She shook her head. "No. Mercy would have been leaving something behind." She opened the ledger again. A few loose pages fell free, drifting into the mud. One caught on a bit of wire, fluttering like a pale flag in the wind. I bent to pick it up, but Rose stopped me. "Let it go," she said. "Maybe it's better that way. The city doesn't want to remember." We stood there as the workmen began to fill the pit, shovels striking the earth in dull rhythm. Dust rose around us, soft and gray, and for a moment it looked like fog again, like the kind that used to seep through Wilmot's windows on winter nights. When the foreman called for lunch, the men left their tools and wandered off toward the pub. I stayed behind, looking at the ground where the house had been. I tried to imagine the sound of it, the coughs, the murmurs, the laughter that sometimes dared to exist between them. But the noise wouldn't come. The silence had swallowed it too completely. Only the river nearby still moved, carrying London's secrets out to sea. Rose closed the ledger and handed it back to me. "Keep it," she said. "If no one else will remember, we will." As we walked away, I glanced back once more. The empty lot shimmered faintly in the sun, the air above it wavering like heat. And for a heartbeat, I thought I saw it again. The crooked roof, the narrow door, the glow of a single candle behind a broken window. Then it was gone. Tell me, when a place disappears, does it die? Or does it simply decide it's had enough of being seen? They called it the exhibition of modern progress. Posters were everywhere, bold letters promising a vision of London's future. Gaslight, sanitation, philanthropy, empire. Entry 6 pence. Children half price. Rose brought me one of the handbills. "They've got a whole section on the East End," she said, voice unreadable. "A living display. Thought we might see what we've become." We went on a damp Thursday, walking past the grand gates of South Kensington where the carriages lined up in shining rows. Gentlemen in top hats, ladies in silks, children with sticky fingers and polished shoes, all flocking to see what progress looked like. Inside, the hall was enormous. Glass ceilings arched overhead like the ribs of a whale. Every surface gleamed. Everywhere there was light, too much of it, as if brightness itself could erase the shadows it came from. The first rooms displayed marvels of invention. Machines that washed clothes, telegraphs that spoke across oceans, a new type of gas lamp that promised to banish darkness forever. "Darkness doesn't give up that easy," Rose muttered beside me. Then we reached it, the section labeled "The Life of the Poor." A red curtain marked the entrance. Beyond it stood a series of glass enclosures, each one a careful reconstruction. A model of a doss house, a tenement room, a corner of Whitechapel Street, recreated with such precision it made my stomach turn. People were gathered around, pointing and whispering. One woman clutched her husband's arm. Can you imagine? To live like that. A child laughed and pressed his face to the glass. "Look, Papa." The man inside's coughing. They'd hired actors. Real men sitting on fake bunks, pretending to starve. One of them even wore rags tied with twine, the same way Fitzgerald used to bind his coat. A placard read, Typical lodging house resident, circa 1888. Average life expectancy, 32 years. Typical, Rose said quietly, like a butterfly pinned to a board. We moved to the next display, the East End woman. Behind the glass sat a young actress in a torn shawl, holding a wooden doll. A sign beneath her feet read, Mothers of Industry. Smile, a visitor called and she did, on command. Rose turned away trembling. They've turned it into theater. I didn't know what to say. The scene was both absurd and unbearable, a mausoleum disguised as education. At the end of the corridor, a final case caught my eye. Inside lay a few authentic artifacts donated by the city. A chipped mug, a pair of children's shoes, a rusted tin box, and, my breath caught, the ledger. It sat open beneath the glass, pages carefully arranged so the inked names could be read. At the bottom, the same line still visible, Henry Fitzgerald, came home in the end. A tag beside it read, Anonymous record of an East End lodging house, donor unknown. Rose's hand went to her mouth. They took it, she whispered. They took it and caged it. I leaned closer. In the reflection of the glass, I saw us both, older, cleaner perhaps, but unmistakably part of what was being displayed. A young man nearby pointed at the book. Incredible, isn't it? Imagine living like that. Rose looked at him, then at me. We don't have to imagine. We stood there a long time. Around us, people kept moving, talking, laughing, pitying. But for us, the hall had gone silent. The air smelled faintly of polish and dust, civilized decay. Finally, Rose spoke. Maybe it's right, she said. Maybe this is the only way the city remembers, by trapping what it killed behind glass. Do you believe that? She shrugged. Belief doesn't change the exhibit. As we left, a voice from a nearby stall called out, Souvenir prints of the exhibition. The Poor of London, 6 pence each. Rose stopped. They're selling us now. I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat. Outside, fog had begun to settle again, soft and gray. Smoke from the city mixed with it until the air itself seemed made of ghosts. We walked without speaking, past rows of lamps that glowed like promises no one meant to keep. When we reached the river, Rose stopped and looked back. Maybe someday, she said, someone will read the names without pity. Just as history, I said. Just as people, she replied. The wind carried her words across the water, scattering them like ashes. Tell me, when memory becomes a museum piece, does it preserve the truth, or just the comfort of forgetting? The letter arrived on a day when snow was falling again, slow, uncertain flakes that melted before they reached the ground. It came to the docks, tucked between manifests and shipping invoices, sealed with wax the color of faded plum. The clerk handed it to me absently. Looks personal, he said. Postmarks from Kent. I turned it over. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, letters formed with the precision of someone who had once taught children their alphabet. Across the front it read, To whomever knew Henry Fitzgerald. For a long moment I couldn't open it. The name felt too heavy for paper to hold. Finally I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet, written in a careful, trembling hand. Dear sir, if you are reading this, you must have known my husband, Henry. A man in Whitechapel, a nurse I think, wrote last spring to say he had passed and that he was not alone. The letter said his friends remembered him kindly and that his name was written in a book. Our children are grown now. They do not remember their father's face, only the stories I told, that he was kind, and that life broke him but never made him cruel. I wish to thank whoever sat beside him at the end, whoever kept him from dying among strangers. The book still exists, please keep it safe. Sometimes that's the only immortality the poor are allowed. With gratitude, Emily Fitzgerald. I read it twice, then again. Each time, the words grew quieter until they seemed to whisper themselves. I carried the letter to the river that evening. The air was colder than I remembered, sharp enough to bite. Across the water, lights shimmered through the mist, faint reflections of a world that kept moving while others stopped. Rose met me there, wrapped in her patched shawl. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said. In a way, I have. I handed her the letter. She read it slowly, lips moving as though afraid the words might fade if spoken aloud. When she finished, she folded it carefully. She still believes he came home. He did, I said. Just not where she expected. We stood in silence for a while. The Thames lapped softly against the pier. Somewhere, a whistle blew from the docks, long, low, and lonely. Do you think we should write back? Rose asked. What would we say? That he mattered. I looked down at the water. The reflection of the gaslights trembled with each ripple, as though the city itself were breathing. Maybe she already knows. Rose nodded. Maybe she just wanted proof that someone else knew too. I reached into my coat and took out the ledger, the same one we'd rescued from Wilmot's ruins. Its leather had hardened, edges curled with age. I turned to Fitzgerald's page. The ink had faded but not vanished. I added a line beneath his name, remembered and not alone. Rose watched me write. That's better than any grave, she said softly. We walked the riverbank until the lamps burned low. The fog grew thick again, wrapping London in its endless veil. As we passed beneath the bridge, a child's voice echoed faintly from somewhere above, singing, perhaps, or just calling into the night. For a moment, I thought of Eli with his box of matches, of Barney's laugh, of every name that filled those fragile pages. Rose stopped, looking out toward the water. Do you ever feel like we're all just letters, she asked, sent out into the world, hoping someone will read us before we're lost? I smiled. Then maybe memory is the postman. She laughed, a soft, tired sound that somehow made the cold less sharp. We turned back toward Whitechapel, our footsteps echoing in rhythm with the river's tide. The city around us slept uneasily, dreaming in smoke. Later that night, as I lay awake, I unfolded Emily's letter again. The ink shimmered faintly in the candlelight, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw Fitzgerald's handwriting beneath hers, faint notes, invisible to all but memory. I whispered his name once, not as prayer but as punctuation. And for the first time in a long while, the silence that answered felt like something kind. Tell me, when the dead are spoken of with love, do they return, or do they simply never leave? Spring came early that year. Not the gray thaw London usually calls spring, but a real one. Soft light, damp earth, a sky almost blue. The newspapers were full of talk about progress again. Electric trams, public baths, new housing laws. Whitechapel was improving, they said. I went to see it for myself. The streets looked cleaner, straighter, brighter, but not familiar. Where Wilmot's once stood, a row of red brick flats now climbed toward the clouds. Fresh paint, white curtains, a sign that read, City Model Dwellings, established 1890. Children played in the courtyard, shouting, laughing. Their shoes were worn but real. A woman leaned from a window, calling them in for supper. From a distance it looked like hope. I stood by the gate until one of the caretakers noticed. You looking for someone? He asked. No, I said. Something. He nodded politely, used to strangers chasing ghosts, and went back inside. The air smelled of soap instead of smoke. Even the fog seemed thinner here, as if the city had scrubbed its own skin. But under it all, I could still feel the heartbeat of the old streets, the rhythm of boots and hunger, of men coughing in their sleep. The city might change its face, but its bones remembered. Rose met me by the river that evening. She'd taken work at a small school near Spitalfields, teaching letters to children who no longer sold them in the streets. You've seen it then? She asked. The flats? Yes. And? They're better than Wilmot's. She smiled. That's not saying much. We walked together along the embankment. The Thames rolled on beneath us, slow and patient, like an old story being told again. The lamps were electric now, bright, steady, without the flicker of gaslight. For the first time, London's night had no pulse. Rose looked out over the water. Do you think they'll remember any of it? The fever, the hunger, the ones we lost. Cities don't forget, I said. They just learn to hide what they remember. We stopped at the place where the Museum of Smoke had once displayed its perfect little ghosts. The building was being renovated into offices. Progress again. Through the scaffolding, I glimpsed a crate marked archive material. Inside it, half buried in straw, I saw the ledger. The same worn cover, the same ink bleeding through the spine. I didn't open it. Some stories don't need more words. I only rested my hand on it briefly, like greeting an old friend through glass. Still there, Rose said quietly. Still here, I answered. The wind came in from the south, carrying the faint clang of ship bells and the scent of salt. The world beyond London waited, as it always had, indifferent and immense. I'm leaving soon, she said. There's work in Portsmouth. A proper school, they say. Windows, even books. I nodded. You'll teach them well. And you? Stay, I think. Someone has to keep the map. She laughed softly. The map. Of what was? Of who was? We watched the lights ripple across the Thames. For a long time, neither of us spoke. At last, she said, "We never did get our own ending." I smiled. Maybe that's what this is. She reached out, squeezed my hand once, then let go. Good night, then. Good night, Rose. She walked away through the fog until the city folded her up, as it does with all its stories, tucking them between bricks and lamplight, waiting for someone to remember. When she was gone, I stood alone by the river. The water moved steadily, carrying silt and ash and time itself out to sea. Behind me, the electric lamps hummed. Ahead, the darkness stretched like a question with no need for an answer. I took out the last scrap of paper I owned, a torn page from the ledger, and wrote one line. Whitechapel remembered. Then I folded it once, let it fall into the river, and watched it drift away until it vanished among the ripples. London exhaled. The fog shifted. Somewhere far off, a bell rang, not for death, not for mourning, just because bells must ring. Tell me, when a city remembers, is it through the stories we keep, or through the silences that never quite let us go?